The Copper Empire. How China turned scrap metal into red gold. Have you ever stopped to think that that giant copper pot might have come from the remains of old machines, abandoned wires, and discarded motors? And more than that, that the largest center of this process in the world today is China? What you're about to see isn't just recycling, it's a true industrial machine that transforms metallic waste into pure wealth. And if you enjoy behind-the-scenes factory glimpses, impressive processes, and curiosities that almost no one shows, subscribe to the channel now because you won't find this kind of content anywhere else. In China, copper recycling is not just an environmental activity, it's a national economic strategy. Millions of tons of scrap metal arrive daily at industrial centers from demolitions, electronic waste, old machinery, and industrial cables. Everything is separated with almost surgical precision. Each piece of copper is treated as an asset. Nothing is lost. Everything is reused within a system that works like clockwork. If this is already surprising you, leave a like now so YouTube can spread this video and more people can see this incredible process. Inside these factories, what was once waste immediately begins to gain value. Copper is cleaned, crushed, separated by purity, and prepared for smelting. Giant furnaces reach absurd temperatures, transforming tons of scrap metal into rivers of incandescent liquid metal. This is where the old is reborn. This is where the disposable becomes precious again. And it is precisely at this point that China has become a world leader. What's most impressive is that many of these factories operate 24 hours a day, without stopping. Shifts alternate while the copper is melted, molded, cooled, and transformed into new form. In a single day, tons of recycled copper are ready to become wires, sheets, pipes, and of course, the giant copper pots you see in these videos. Comment below if you imagine that China dominated this process to this extent. I want to see if you already knew this. And it is precisely from here that the journey of the famous recycled copper pans begins. They are not made from virgin ore. They are made of history, of reuse, of machines that have already served for decades and now gain a new life in the kitchen. What seemed like just industry reveals, in fact, a new cycle of existence for the metal. From scrap to furnace, where Chinese copper is reborn in the fire. After being separated and classified, the copper goes to the heart of Chinese factories, the foundry. Here, the scene changes completely. The noise of the crushers gives way to the continuous roar of the furnaces. The air is hot, heavy, vibrant. Highly trained workers control every detail of the temperature because a few degrees of error can compromise tons of material. Copper melts at over 1,000 degrees. When it enters a liquid state, it looks like living lava. A hypnotic and at the same time frightening spectacle. And it is precisely at this stage that the purity of the metal is refined. Impurities rise to the surface, are removed, and the copper becomes increasingly pure, brighter, and more valuable. If you're enjoying this deep dive into Chinese factories, subscribe to the channel now because the next chapters are going to be even more impressive. When the copper reaches the ideal point, it is poured into giant molds. Bars, discs, thick sheets, it all depends on the final destination of the material. In the case of pans, the copper begins its transformation into large, still raw, heavy, and reddish circular discs. Nothing yet resembles the final piece, but the raw material is already ready. These discs then go into monstrous hydraulic presses, machines that mold the copper under tons of pressure. Little by little, the disc begins to gain depth, body, shape. In a few minutes, something that was just a metal plate begins to become a pot. This is where Chinese engineering and artisanal tradition meet. Leave a comment now saying if you'd like to see a video just showing these presses in action. This really helps in choosing future content. Production doesn't stop. While some batches are in the foundry, others are already being molded, hammered, adjusted, and prepared for finishing. The pace is industrial, but many details still depend on the human hand. Fine adjustments, edges, perfect thickness. Each pan literally bears the mark of fire and human effort. The sound of hammers, where machine meets human hand. After the pot takes its initial shape in the hydraulic presses, it is still far from finished. The copper emerges with imperfections, small irregularities, and internal stresses caused by the extreme pressure. It is at this point that the most important human work in the entire process comes into play, the technical hammering. Each blow has a specific function. Inside Chinese factories, entire teams spend their days adjusting each piece by hand. The rhythmic sound of hammers echoes through the warehouses like a metallic orchestra. It's not brute force, it's precision. Each hammer blow corrects thicknesses, strengthens the walls of the pan, and ensures that heat will be evenly distributed during use. If you never imagined that these pans were made with manual labor, leave a like now to support this content. What's most impressive is that many of these professionals learn the technique at a young age, within the industrial regions themselves. They spend years training until they reach perfection. Amidst giant machines, it is still the human hand that gives the final touch to the copper structure. Technology and tradition work side by side on the same factory floor. After hammering, the pans go to the edge adjustment and final thickness stage. Rotating machines refine the edges to prevent flaws, future cracks, and ensure safe handling. Every detail is reviewed. Nothing goes uninspected, because any error here compromises the final product. Comment now if you would use a pan like this, knowing all about the process behind it. I want to know your opinion. This is where the pots and pans begin to acquire their identity. They are no longer just molded metal. They now possess strength, thermal balance, and structure. In a few steps, they will go from raw pieces to utensils of high commercial value worldwide. The birth of shine, polishing, details, and perfection. After the structural work comes the phase that completely changes the appearance of the pan, polishing. The copper, which until then was dull, marked by fire and hammers, begins to reveal its true shine. Rotating machines, abrasive discs, and special compounds come into play to leave the surface as smooth as a mirror. Polishing is not just about aesthetics. It removes micro cracks, corrects minor irregularities, and increases the material's durability. All of this is done in stages, starting with more aggressive abrasives and finishing with extremely fine compounds that impart that deep reddish hue typical of pure copper. If you're finding this process fascinating, subscribe to the channel now because the most crucial part is yet to come. At this stage, each pan is individually inspected. Any stain, flaw, or visual distortion means rework or disposal. In large Chinese factories, thousands of pieces undergo this inspection every day. The standard of requirement is extremely high, especially for export. After external polishing, the pan undergoes light heat treatments to stabilize the metal. This prevents the copper from warping over time when exposed to intense temperature variations during use. It's a type of controlled rest for the metal before the final stage. Let us know in the comments if you've ever owned or cooked in a copper pot. Your experience helps a lot of people here. Now, with the shine activated, the structure perfected, and the final shape ready, the pans are about to enter the phase that determines if they can truly be used for safe cooking, the internal coating. And that's where the process gets even more surprising. Tin plating, the protection that makes copper safe. After all the external polishing, the pans move on to one of the most delicate stages of the entire process, the internal tin coating. Copper conducts heat exceptionally well, but it cannot come into direct contact with food. Therefore, this plating is essential to transform the raw metal into a safe utensil. Inside Chinese factories, tin is heated to its precise melting point. Then it is manually applied to the inside of the pans. The molten metal spreads rapidly across the heated inner walls, forming a uniform, shiny protective layer. It's a job that demands extreme precision. Each pan is carefully rotated to ensure no area is left uncovered. A flaw in this coating can completely compromise the use of the product. Therefore, specialized technicians closely monitor each application. The silvery sheen of the tin contrasts impressively with the red of the copper exterior. After the plating process, the pans undergo controlled cooling. The tin solidifies, creating a smooth, resistant surface that is completely safe for food preparation. This layer protects the copper from internal oxidation and prevents any type of contamination. Only after this stage do the pans officially become suitable for culinary use. Before that, they were merely industrial pieces undergoing transformation. Now they are ready to enter the environment of professional and domestic kitchens around the world. Extreme tests, where only the best survive. With the coating complete, a phase that few see begins, but which defines the true quality of the product. Testing. Copper pans produced in China undergo rigorous thermal controls before being released to the market. The goal is to ensure they can withstand high temperatures without warping. The parts are returned to the fire, this time under simulated real-world use conditions. Rapid heating, sudden cooling, continuous exposure to heat. Everything is recorded, monitored, and analyzed by sensors and trained operators. Any deviation from the norm is grounds for immediate disposal. In addition to thermal testing, there are also meticulous structural inspections. Edges, foundations, rivets, handles, and fittings are examined for micro cracks invisible to the naked eye. Ultrasound and pressure equipment assist in this process, ensuring that no flaw goes unnoticed. Pots that don't meet the required standard simply don't go any further. The copper is reused, returning to the beginning of the cycle. This reinforces the very concept of continuous reuse that underpins this entire production chain. At the end of the tests, only the pans that demonstrate complete excellence proceed to the final finishing, packaging, and distribution phase. It is at this moment that they officially leave the industrial environment and go out into the world, the detail that defines the value, the final finish. Everything seems ready. Perfect structure, intense shine, safe coating, approved tests. But it is now that Chinese factories enter the quietest and, at the same time, most decisive phase of the entire production. The final finishing. It is at this point that an ordinary pan can become a piece of high commercial value, or just another product among millions. The parts undergo almost invisible adjustments. Small misalignments are corrected, micro burrs removed, and minute imperfections treated with very fine tools. These are details that few consumers notice, but they determine durability, thermal efficiency, and even the sound the pan makes when placed on the stove. What's most striking is that even on gigantic industrial lines, this step still demands absolute concentration. A microscopic error can compromise weeks of work. A simple oversight in the rivet of a handle, for example, can turn a high-quality part back into scrap. After that comes the marking. Some factories apply stamps, punches, or laser engravings. Others keep the copper completely pure, without visual interference. This decision is not merely aesthetic. It defines the product's positioning in the global market, whether as a mass-market item or a premium piece. And this is where most people are mistaken. Two seemingly identical pans can have completely different values because of these final details. What nobody sees in the quick internet video is precisely what weighs most heavily on the real cost: the invisible line between the factory and the world. When the pots leave the finishing area, they enter a sector that rarely appears in recordings: the final sorting for export. Here, the pace changes. The industrial noise gives way to the concentrated silence of continuous inspections. Each piece is evaluated as if it were unique, even among thousands. They are weighed, measured, aligned, and compared to international standards. Different countries require different standards. Some of these pans will go to luxury restaurant kitchens, others to specialty shops, and still others to popular markets. It all depends on tiny millimeter variations. Then comes the packaging. Layers and more layers of protection. Foam, reinforced boxes, rigid partitions. It's no exaggeration. During transport, every impact can compromise months of work. Between the factory in China and the shelf on the other side of the world, the pan will face ships, trucks, ports, and distribution centers. At that moment, something curious happens. The object, born from fire, scrap metal, and extreme pressure, begins to be treated with almost fragile care, as if it ceased to be merely metal and became something that cannot suffer the slightest damage. And then, Without announcement, without fanfare, without the consumer even noticing, this pan enters the global market. Most people will never imagine that before reaching their kitchen, it went through one of the most complex industrial processes on the planet. The invisible control, how China manipulates the value of copper in the world. While the copper pots silently make their way to cargo ships, something far bigger is happening outside the factories. In rooms rarely seen in documentaries, China controls massive stockpiles of recycled and refined copper. Tons remain strategically stored, awaiting the right moment to enter the market. This volume control allows for something extremely powerful, direct influence over the global price of copper. When supply increases, prices fall. When there is hoarding, the value skyrockets. And since China recycles, refines, transforms, and exports, it acts at all points of the process simultaneously. Few realize it, but every copper pot sold in the world has this invisible financial mechanism embedded within it. It's not just production cost, it's geopolitics, commercial strategy, and industrial dominance. A simple household utensil connects without anyone noticing to decisions that move billions. What's most striking is that it all starts exactly where we saw at the beginning, with scrap metal. What the world discards feeds a system that defines prices, routes, and entire markets. Copper no longer comes solely from mines. It comes from recycling on a continental scale, and that's precisely why few nations can compete at this level. It's not enough to have the ore. You need logistics, industry, labor, technology, trade routes, and above all, control over the flow of the metal itself. The domino effect. How a pan in your kitchen impacts the world. When a Chinese pot arrives in a distant country, it carries more than just molded metal. It carries invisible impacts on entire economies. Local factories often cannot compete with the final price. Artisans disappear. Workshops close silently. At the same time, restaurants, chefs, and consumers benefit from more accessible, cheaper, and large-scale products. High-performance copper is no longer a rare item and is becoming part of everyday kitchens. An old luxury is transforming into something relatively attainable, but this access comes at a hidden cost. Each imported pan redefines the balance between local and global production. Dependence increases, the market adapts, and what was once made in small workshops now depends on industrial giants operating thousands of kilometers away. Meanwhile, in China, the factories keep turning non-stop. The scrap metal keeps arriving. The copper keeps melting. The presses don't shut down. The cycle closes, repeats, and strengthens with each new container shipped. And without realizing it, the end consumer participates in this global movement every time they turn on the stove and place the pan on the flame. A simple gesture, connected to an industrial chain that crosses oceans, politics, economies, and silent decisions. The future of copper, between automation and the end of waste. The Chinese factories that now dominate copper recycling no longer resemble those of a few years ago. Robots, sensors, and artificial intelligence have taken over critical parts of the process. Precision has increased. Defects have decreased. The pace has become almost uninterrupted. Copper now flows with the logic of machines. Automated systems analyze the purity of the metal in real time. Temperature adjustments are made in fractions of a second. Human error, which previously defined inevitable losses, is slowly beginning to disappear. Fire remains essential, but it is now guided by data, calculations, and digital predictions. At the same time, scrap metal collection is also evolving. Entire cities have begun to treat metal disposal as a strategic resource. What used to go to landfills now follows direct routes to recycling centers. Metallic waste is officially transformed into high-value raw material. This advancement creates a silent disruption to the traditional mining model. Dependence on underground resources begins to decrease. Copper is no longer solely extracted from the earth, but is now recovered from the world's existing infrastructure. Buildings, machines, cables, and engines become future reserves. In this scenario, copper pots cease to be merely finished products. They become symbols of a new cycle, born from waste, existing in use, and returning to the system when their time is up. a closed, continuous, and increasingly dominant cycle. The final destination. When copper returns to the beginning years later, that same pan, born from scrap metal, crossed oceans and became part of a kitchen's daily routine, reaches the end of its first useful life. Scratched, deformed, worn by time, it seems to have no value anymore. But it is precisely at this point that everything begins again. It returns to the same system that created it. It is discarded, collected, separated along with other metals. It returns to the sorting conveyors. It enters the furnaces again. It melts again. And without anyone noticing, it becomes part of a new object, with a different shape, a different function, a different destiny. Copper carries no visible memory, but it carries invisible cycles. The pan that was once over a flame may tomorrow exist inside an electrical wire, a pipe, a new pan, or an unknown component. Its identity changes, but the material remains. In this scenario, China is not just a manufacturer. It becomes the center of this great, silent transformation, where the end of an object is never truly the end, just a transition between functions within the same industrial flow. And when someone picks up a copper pot, shiny, heavy, and perfect, they can hardly imagine that it was once a broken motor, a discarded cable, or part of an abandoned machine. What you see is only the surface. What lies beneath is an entire cycle that never stops. Thus, copper continues to exist through the ages, changing form, crossing countries, markets, and generations, always returning to the fire, always returning to the beginning.